They call him a dictator. They call him authoritarian. But what no one explains to you is how a man without oil, without gold, and without democracy built one of the richest countries on the planet. And the most uncomfortable part? It worked. Imagine waking up in a country that technically shouldn't even exist as an independent nation. A small dot on the map, with no natural resources, no fresh water of its own, no oil, no agricultural land, and no obvious advantage whatsoever. A territory so insignificant that, for decades, it was seen merely as an improvised port, a place of passage, not a destination. That was Singapore in the early 1960s. The city smelled of garbage, sewage, and despair. Half the population lived in overcrowded slums, built from rotten wood and rusted metal sheets. Fires were common. So were diseases. Unemployment was soaring, and crime was growing faster than the economy. Gangs controlled entire neighborhoods, unions paralyzed strategic sectors, and ethnic tensions threatened to explode at any moment. Now, add a crucial detail. Singapore had just been expelled from Malaysia. It was not a friendly separation, it was a forced divorce. Overnight, the island lost its internal market, its political connections, and any economic safety net. It became independent, not by choice, but by rejection. The Prime Minister cried in public when announcing independence. And it wasn't theater. At that moment, Singapore was not an emerging country. It was an international problem in the making. Foreign analysts predicted bankruptcy. Diplomats spoke of permanent instability. Some believed the island would eventually be absorbed by a stronger neighbor or plunge into a spiral of internal violence. The banks were fragile. Foreign investment was almost non-existent. The state had little money, little credibility, and zero margin for error. Any wrong decision could mean total collapse. And here comes the most ironic detail of all. While today we associate Singapore with efficiency, order, and extreme wealth, back then even the most optimistic economists avoided making predictions. Not because they were afraid of being wrong, but because they saw no solution at all. To them, Singapore violated every rule in the Economic Development Handbook. Poor countries needed resources. They needed territory. They needed time. Singapore had none of that. It was too small to be relevant, too fragile to be stable, too divided to be united. And yet, someone in the middle of that chaos looked at the situation and thought, if we don't have natural resources, we will become an elite human resource. If we don't have time, we will accelerate. If we have no margin for error, we will not tolerate incompetence. While the world saw a lost cause, Singapore became a radical laboratory, a place where extreme decisions would be tested not out of ideology, but out of survival. Because at that point in history, this was no longer about politics. It was about existing, or disappearing. When people talk about Singapore's success, the official story is almost always presented as an inspiring textbook case of economic development, a clean, organized narrative that's easy to export to conferences, business books, and PowerPoint presentations. According to this version, Singapore became one of the richest countries in the world thanks to three main factors: free markets, international trade, and good governance. A small country that embraced globalization early, opened its doors to foreign investment, created a business-friendly environment, and reaped the rewards of capitalist efficiency. It's the perfect story, simple, reassuring, and politically safe. In this narrative, the government appears as a neutral referee. It sets clear rules, keeps taxes low, invests in education and infrastructure, and lets the market do the rest. Multinationals arrive, jobs appear, productivity explodes, and almost by magic, prosperity takes hold. This is the version taught in universities. This is the version cited by political leaders when they want to prove that capitalism works. This is the version repeated by consultants when they talk about competitiveness and structural reforms. But there is a serious problem with this story. It starts too late. the official narrative begins when Singapore is already stable, when corruption has already been crushed, when political opposition has already been neutralized, when social control is already firmly in place. Everything that came before that conveniently disappears from the frame. Because technically, yes, Singapore used the market, but the market was not free in the classical sense. The state did not simply create conditions and step aside. Quite the opposite. The government chose strategic sectors, directed investment, controlled unions, regulated wages, shaped social behavior, and intervened aggressively whenever it sensed a risk of instability. In the official story, people talk about a pro-business environment. What is rarely explained is how that environment was created. It was not built through long democratic consensus. It was not built through open political negotiation, and it certainly was not built through tolerance for error. It was created through fast, centralized, and often unpopular decisions. Another key pillar of the official narrative is meritocracy. Singapore likes to present itself as a society where talent is rewarded regardless of background. And to some extent, that's true. The education system was transformed into a machine for selecting technical elites. The best rose. The incompetent were discarded. But what the official story rarely mentions is that this meritocracy was imposed from the top down with criteria defined by the state, not emerging from the market or civil society. The government decided what merit meant. It decided which skills mattered. It decided who moved forward and who was left behind. None of this fits neatly into the romantic idea of a free market. And then there is the myth of political neutrality. The official version suggests that stability and growth emerged naturally as a result of sound technical decisions. But it ignores the fact that political space was severely restricted. Newspapers were controlled. Critics were sued. Public debate was narrowed. All in the name of order and predictability. The story you are told is comforting because it suggests that all you need to do is copy economic policies and everything will work. It reduces Singapore's success to a replicable model. But that version ignores the most uncomfortable part. Growth came hand in hand with control, enforced discipline, and zero tolerance for dissent during crucial decades. And this is where the friction begins. Because if you believe only the official story, you reach the wrong conclusion. That Singapore is just another proof that the market solves everything. The reality is far more complex and far more uncomfortable. Because here's the part that rarely appears in the textbooks. Lee Kuan Yew did not believe that poor countries could afford total freedom. In his view, democracy before stability did not create prosperity. It created chaos. So he did the unthinkable. Corrupt officials were not fired. They were imprisoned, publicly, regardless of rank. Judges, well paid. Politicians, monitored. Bribes, treated as crimes against the state. Singapore became one of the only countries where stealing from the government was a terrible career move. Foreign companies were welcome, but under strict rules. Low taxes, perfect infrastructure, zero tolerance for instability. In return, the government decided where, how, and with whom you grew. It wasn't free market. It was capitalism disciplined by force. And it worked, frighteningly well. But the price of that success was still to come. As the money started to flow, something strange happened. People became richer, but less free. Newspapers controlled. Critics sued into bankruptcy. Political opposition neutralized by laws, not by tanks. You didn't need to disappear. It was enough to be financially destroyed. Some call it smart authoritarianism. Others call it a dictatorship in a suit and tie. The government built homes for almost the entire population, but not out of altruism. If you own your home, you have something to lose. And people with something to lose don't start revolutions. This was the moment the world realized. Singapore was not rich despite state control. It was rich because of it. investors trusted, companies settled in, capital flowed. While other countries debated ideology, Singapore executed. No endless debates, no endless strikes, no asking for opinions on Twitter, but here's the detail almost no one talks about. The real impact of Singapore's model doesn't end with skyscrapers, flawless airports, or economic rankings where the country always sits at the top. The deepest impact is invisible, and it continues to shape political decisions around the world to this day. Singapore's greatest legacy was not just wealth, it was the normalization of a dangerous idea that economic prosperity can, and perhaps should, come before political freedom. After Singapore's success, leaders in various countries began using the same argument. First growth, then democracy. The phrase became a rhetorical shield, a moral shortcut, a polished way to justify control, censorship, and concentration of power in the name of efficiency. But here's the detail that is almost never discussed. Singapore's model is not easily replicable. Lee Kuan Yew built a highly centralized system in a very specific context. A small country, a tiny population, a strategic geographic location, and, above all, leadership obsessed with competence, intolerant of corruption, and willing to punish allies as harshly as enemies. When that same model is copied by less competent, less ethical, or simply greedier leaders, the result is not prosperity. It is stagnation with repression. It is authoritarianism without efficiency. Singapore became the exception used to justify the rule. Another hidden impact lies in how we now perceive the state. The country redefined what good governance means, not as political representation, but as the delivery of results. Housing, security, growth, order. If the state delivers these, many people accept losing voice, debate, and opposition. This influenced entire generations of policymakers, technocrats, and investors. It created the idea that citizens are, above all, economic stakeholders. And there is yet another, subtler impact, one closer to you. The global obsession with efficiency, the intolerance of error, the idea that everything must run like a company. All of this echoes experiences like Singapore's. High cost of living, constant pressure to perform, shrinking space to fail. These are side effects of a world that has learned to value results above processes. Singapore showed that the system can work, but it left one question unanswered. When everything works, who decides who it works for? At the end of this story, the most important question is not economic, it's human. Because Singapore forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The real world does not operate according to simple moral slogans. There is no magic button called democracy that, when pressed, automatically generates prosperity. And there is no authoritarian model that guarantees success just because it promises order. What Singapore proved was not that dictatorships are good. It proved something far more unsettling. Extreme competence can compensate for serious political legitimacy failures, at least for a while. Lee Kuan Yew did not succeed because he was authoritarian. He succeeded because he was obsessively focused on results, intolerant of corruption, and brutally realistic about his country's limitations. He treated governance as engineering, not ideology. Every decision was evaluated with a simple question: does this work or not? But here's the part many people overlook. This type of leadership is extremely rare. Most authoritarian regimes are not led by brilliant, incorruptible technocrats. They are led by flawed, vain, and often incompetent people. When such leaders copy the Singapore model, they copy only the control, not the discipline, the ethics, or the execution capacity. And that's where everything goes wrong. So this story should not be read as a defense of authoritarianism, nor as an attack on democracy. It should be read as a warning, a reminder that political systems fail not just from bad intentions, but from poor execution, and that economic systems collapse not from lack of ideas, but from excess ego, corruption, and denial of reality. Singapore shows us that wealth is not just about natural resources, nor ideology. It's about strong institutions, well-designed incentives, and real accountability, something rare in any system. But it also forces us to ask a personal question. If you had to choose between total economic security and limited political freedom, what would you choose? Not in theory, in practice. Because when we look at today's world, the cost of living, the pressure to perform, the obsession with efficiency, the growing tolerance for strong governments, we realize that this choice is already being made quietly in many countries. And perhaps the greatest lesson of this story is this: a nation's true wealth is not measured by GDP alone. It is measured by the ability to grow without losing its soul. Singapore solved the problem of poverty, but it left open the debate about the price of control. And that debate is far from over. If this kind of content made you think, question, or even disagree, then it's working. Subscribe and share this with someone who still believes that economics is just about numbers. Comment, would you live in this system? Yes or no, and why? And if you want more real stories where power, money, and hard decisions intersect, stay tuned. In the next episode, we'll analyze the country that tried to copy this model without the right leadership. And the result was disastrous,